In this episode,
at that time, it was the best-selling book series, but it was about to be supplanted by Harry Potter. They discovered that 88% of Americans knew what Chicken Soup for the Soul was. One year we got congratulated because we had some book that sold 300 million copies in China. Like, that's really nice. That was not our book. It was the absolute end of the world. Like, banks were failing. Everything was shutting down. Businesses all over the place were failing. It was probably a terrible time to buy a big media property.
I worked that out to be about 12 to 13 books a year. Now, that is a pretty phenomenal output. So let's talk about how on earth do you manage to do that? And then I have this download, literally, that I have to sit down and write. And it's like, I don't want to do this. I want to sleep. It's pitch black. One of the things I didn't tell you was the name of the project. I just looked at that word. I stared at it for a few seconds and I got this really incredible feeling. It was like in that moment, something had been born. I could not believe that this word has not existed in the English language or any other language that I could see ever in the history of humankind. And I went onto Google and I typed in those 8 letters, P-A-C-I. Hello and welcome to the Bestseller Experiment, where we explore the inner game of writing and inspire you to start, finish and publish a best-selling book. I'm Mark Desvaux, and in this episode, I interview Amy Newmark, who runs Chicken Soup for the Soul, the most successful anthology series of all time with, are you ready for this? Over 500 million book sales. That's 500 million, I think, in modern numbers. But anyway, before I dive in, I'd like to also thank our wonderful patrons and Bestseller Academy members. And this week, our patron of the week is none other than the wonderful Steve Gowland. And our Academy member of the week is the wonderful Fiona Higgins. And for both of you, I'm going to be doing a little feature on you, a little surprise feature later on in the show. Now, for those of you who were listening last week, you'll have heard me make a absolutely bonkers dream declaration that I was going to be writing a new non-fiction book over the next year. And my aim was to reach 1 million people by doing so. Now, not in the next year. I'm going to write the book in the next year, but the aim is over the life of the book. I want to try and reach 1 million. Now, one of the things I didn't tell you was the name of the project and what the actual subtitle of the project is. And the reason being is, if you listen to last week's episode, you'll know that I told this kind of bit of a backstory about how all this came about. But there was a story around the actual title, and I want to share that with you now because it is absolutely mind-blowing. So about 6 to 9 months ago, I can't remember the exact date, but when I started realizing that this was something I really needed to do, it was like I'd hit that kind of decade birthday, really scary decade birthday, where you start to realize, you know what, if I'm not going to get on with this, I'm going to run out of time. So I started to rework this idea of what this project would be. And I know this sounds a bit weird, but in a dream, I woke up one morning with this sense, and I talked about this last week, about this sense that I needed to start to make peace with my life. There was so much turmoil going on. There was so much turmoil in the war as well, you know, and the things that were happening out in society. Everyone seemed to be under so much massive pressure. We'd come out the back end of COVID. We were all trying to find our feet again. Like, there was that kind of weird phase that I think we're still in, where people weren't really socializing. We kind of forgotten how to do it. And we got quite used to being in our own little insular pods in the world. And I started to realize that a major thing that I had to shift in my life was making peace with the number of things that were happening, which I was struggling with. And we all struggle with stuff. And I'm quite happily, you know, openly talking about things that I dealt with over the many years that I've been doing this podcast. And I know that you will have done too, and you still will be. And we all do. We all have our stuff that we have to deal with. But the biggest revelation came to me is I had to start somewhere. And the point of starting was making peace with my life. And that was the line that came to me when I woke up. Now, I know a lot of people probably have similar experiences, especially as writers. You wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, often at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is kind of odd. But that's a time that's been quite well documented where through the circadian rhythm of our sleep, our minds come alive. And sometimes I find that at 3 o'clock in the morning, my creative thought process is so running on steroids almost, that it wakes me up. And then I have this download, literally, that I have to sit down and write. And it's like, I don't want to do this. I want to sleep. It's pitch black. But I literally will get out of bed. I never have a phone beside me. That's one of my number one rules. And I'll be sharing a few of those over the next year in terms of the things that I've done to really completely change my life for the better. But I never have a phone beside my bedside table. So I have to get a notepad and a pen and then scribble down everything that I can think of. Otherwise, I can't get back to sleep because my mind just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning. How many of you have kind of experienced that? I know Mark's day, we discuss this a lot, we kind of waking up more early and early, as we get older. But I find if I don't dump things down at that moment, I'll wake up, at my normal time later on in the morning, and I'll be scrabbling to try and piece together this puzzle that's been it's like someone's picked up a puzzle and they've just thrown it into pieces. And I'm looking around trying to turn over pieces and try and work out what fitted together. So if you experience that, I want to encourage you to kind of have that notebook and pen beside your bed. It's obviously hard when you've got somebody, in the room with you because you don't want to wake them up. But it's really important to capture those ideas when you get them. And this goes for everyone when you're writing. If you're driving the car and you get an amazing idea, and unless you're having to be somewhere at any precise moment, pull over safely and capture that idea. Add it on your voicemails on your phone. Send yourself an email, send yourself a text, or I like to use the voice memos on Apple phones. But anyway, capture those ideas as they happen, because our brains and our memories are not designed to recall information long term because of all of the things that we have, the information overload that we're filling our heads with every single day. And that's why it's harder than ever today, because of all the distractions we've had, the pinging of the phones, all the different social media things that are trying to grab our attention. Our brains are becoming trained to not be able to retain that information for longer than about 6 or 7 or 10 seconds, which is why you have to get it down. Anyway, little tip there. But back to the story. So making peace with my life was this big theme that entered my kind of world. And I started to play with this idea. I started to write some notes on it. And I started to realize that throughout our life, there are always going to be things that hit us, that come into our life, troubles, challenges, struggles in the writing process. I mean, hey, what a great example for life. Throughout the writing process at the beginning of your book, you're all kind of excited and you go out the gates like gangbusters and you start writing like crazy. And then you hit that first point where you think, actually, that character's not really working properly. Or, you get stuck after that initial great idea about what happens next. You might get stuck in how to finish a book even, but there's always problems within the writing process, and it really reflects life. Every single day when we wake up, there will be something which will be unexpected in our life, possibly more than one thing that we have to deal with. And I thought to myself, we struggle with this so much every single day, whether it's the writing process or whether it's our daily lives. So how can we start? Where's the starting point for us to actually change the way in which we interact and respond and react to those problems? So when you think about it, everything that we can control is how we choose to show up in that moment. And it's quite mind-blowing when you really think about it. It's obvious to say it, but really the way that we react to things determines the quality of our life, and it also determines the quality of what you're writing as well. So that is the theme of this massive project. Now, the thing about this project is it's not just about making peace with something. It's not just about thinking, I'll think I'll make peace with this now. It's actually a practice that we have to do. We have to do this, practice it every single day, just like we practice our hygiene routine, just like some of you may practice meditation or yoga or Pilates or going to the gym and working out to strengthen your muscles. This is a practice. And unless we practice it, we will not develop the muscles that we need to get us through those really hard, challenging points in our day, our week, our month, and our year. So what have I called this process? Because I realized making peace with your life, that could be a book title, but I need a hook. I needed something which would capture people's imaginations. And that was the thing that I was working on for about 3 months. Just the title, one idea of a word that I could use. And I searched around and I would do big brainstorming diagrams. I'd use my big whiteboard I have in my studio. I'd use postcards. I'd use all these different ways of trying to come up with ideas. And then one day after spending 3 months trying to work it out, and that was part of the process, I realized I had to go through that for this word to come out. But one day, the word, I wrote it down, and what I'd been doing is I'd been looking at Latin word origin. I went back to specific breaking down of existing words and looked to Latin origin. And I found that making peace with your life, and I broke that up, and I realized that making peace comes from the word pacify. You probably heard of that idea of, pacifying, somebody who's in a difficult situation. And I took the first 4 letters of pacify, which is PACI. Then I thought, right, so I've got passy and I need something else. I need something else for that. And then I thought, well, what is this? Making peace with what? Well, it's making peace with your life, and all the things that we struggle in life with. And I looked up the word your life and I started playing with that. And eventually I landed on this word vida, which is life. And you probably heard, vida, la vida loca, that famous song. And so it comes from like a lot of Latin word origins. Now, I'm no expert in word origins, but when I slammed these 2 parts of a word together, I got passa vida. And I just looked at that word. I stared at it for a few seconds and I got this really incredible feeling. It was like in that moment, something had been born. And then I thought, yeah, but don't get too excited, Mark, because the internet, this is going to be out there. It's going to be used, and I've had this so many times before. I've come up with this idea of a word and I've gone and looked online and someone's used it and someone's put it in a book and someone's done this and someone's registered the domain and all the rest of it. So I thought to myself, if this is meant to be, it will never have been used before. And I went onto Google and I typed in those 8 letters, PACIVIDA, passa vida. And I paused for a moment and I pressed the button to search. 0 results. I could not believe that this word has not existed in the English language or any other language that I could see ever in the history of humankind. I honestly could not believe it because it's such the perfect word. I knew the moment I saw it that this was the word for my project. This was going to be the title of the book. This was going to be the title of everything I was going to be doing for the next 10, 20, 30 years if I'm lucky. Passa vida. So then, again, I mentioned this last week. The next thing I do when I have an idea is I race to the domain registration and I typed it in, thinking, yeah, someone's going to have registered that name. I mean, it's 8 letters. We are 25 to 30 years into domain registrations on the internet. And I used to work for an internet company back in the 90s, very, very early on. And we used to register domain names as part of the business. And I used to sit in front of the domain name registration engine. I could have registered pretty much every word in the English language for about $5 or pounds. Literally, I had no idea at that time that, 30 years later, 25 years later, these domain names would be selling for millions, some of them, like one word domain names. So I know how hard it is to find a word, a .com word, which is what we all want because it's most important word in terms of search engine, which is so important for people finding ideas these days. And I typed it into the search engine for the domain registration. I pressed the search. Not registered. It was available. I absolutely wet myself. So it just felt in that moment that it was almost like the world was just opening up to say, this is, the universe was saying, we're giving this to you to go out into the world, to use in this project, to promote this idea to people of making peace with life. And then it got even more bonkers. I registered the domain name, and then I went on all the social media platforms, Facebook, X, Instagram. Nobody was using the username Passavida. So I grabbed all of those as well. And I just want to inspire you today that when something is meant to be and when something is right, you just get into this flow. Now, I don't fully understand it. I like to think that it's, from a spiritual level, I like to think that, it's your dharma, it's your purpose. It's something that's been given to you that you're kind of meant to midwife into the world. But every single time this has happened to me in my life, it's been effortless, as in all of the things have just opened up to make it happen. And yet when I've really struggled with things, there's always been a huge amount of resistance. And that resistance eventually tells me that I need to find another way, that this way that I'm trying, this jungle that I'm walking through with a machete is not the right approach or is not the right thing I should be doing. So I want you to think about that today. I want you to think about that in your life. I want you to think about that in your writing, what you're struggling with in your writing. And instead of continuing the struggle, maybe look for a different pathway. That might not mean throwing the book away that you're writing. It might just mean, literally taking your character down a different pathway. Or in your life, it might not be, throwing something away that because it's causing you problems in your life. It's actually looking at a way that you might respond differently to it or with it. So that is the story behind Passavida. And there is a website, folks. And I said this last week. I want to bring this concept, this practice of Passavida, and I won't go into huge detail now. I'll share a bit more with you over the course of the podcast. But there is a practice around making peace with life, and I have been practicing it myself as the crash test dummy to see if it works. Because I only ever really like to encourage other people to do something if I've tried it myself, and this absolutely works. I have been using Passavida in my life for the last 6 months. And if you ask the people around me that have, been interacting with me, they will tell you that something's shifted, something's changed. And I feel it. I feel incredibly peaceful. I still have problems. Absolutely. There's still things all flying all over the place. But I just have this completely, incredibly strong foundation of peace, which for people that meditate, how meditation gets you sometimes through the day. It can help you get through some of the challenges when they come. You become a bit like Teflon and they can kind of bounce off you a bit more easily. Well, that's what I'm experiencing with Passavida. So it's not a meditation. I'm not going to go down that route with it, but I want you to explore it with me. So there's a little bit on the website, a tiny bit, just giving you a bit of background. So if you want to go and check it out, you go to passavida.com. Passivida.com, and sign up, and together we'll explore this little journey, and I will start introducing all kinds of things that you can make peace with in your life, whether it's finances, whether it's parenting, relationships, stress, social media, work, overwhelm, information overload, environmental stresses, the world that's going on around us, everything to do with problems in our life. I will be touching on. So join me over there, passavida.com, to find out a bit more. And I will update you, obviously, on this podcast as to how the growth of that project is going, because obviously I'm writing a book around it, which is part of a major central part of the project. But I also want to tell you something very funny, because I've always said this on the podcast, that when you create a dream declaration, you put it out into the world, it opens up the opportunity for other people to come in and help you or to encourage you. And having put out that big declaration last week, I got an email from none other than Susie Edge. Now, Susie has been interviewed on the podcast twice. And Susie, if you remember, is a TikTok sensation. Now, Susie has got over 9 million likes and over 500,000 followers on TikTok. And this is what Susie said to me. She said, when I was driving south over the Scottish hills all alone in my car, except for you and your New Year's Day podcast edition, I heard your 1 million dream declaration and I nodded and said out loud, "That's possible, Mark." So I have a challenge for you. Now, I'm just going to have to stop it there because this is not how it's meant to work, folks. This is not Susie speaking. This is me again. I'm meant to give everyone the challenges, not you giving me challenges, but Susie has laid down the gauntlet and she's given me a challenge. And this is what she said. "I have a challenge for you, Mark. I think it's possible with the help of TikTok. So I'm going to challenge you to get on there with your project too." And then Susie says, "I have over," are you ready for this? 2 million views on TikTok. And this is how I believe in its possibilities. 200 million views on TikTok Susie has gained over the last number of years that she's been on. Now, I've got to say, Susie, this absolutely terrifies me. TikTok feels like this massive vertical wall that I've never quite fully got my head around. The only experience I have of it is seeing shorts online, often from my teen daughter's phone, and it's phenomenal. I mean, Susie, just reference here as well, Susie was nominated just last year for the TikTok Author Award. Now, you all probably heard how huge BookTok is and how stores around the world now, you walk in and they'll have a display table right in the entrance to say, "Book trending on BookTok." I mean, this is such a central part now to book writing that we cannot ignore it any longer. But Susie, you've challenged me to go on TikTok. And to me, that is like the ultimate, because I'm not the best on social media. In terms of engaging and reading, I tend to avoid a bit of social media if I can, because I just find my life gets too busy with it. But with your help, Susie, I am going to accept the challenge. And I'm going to start a TikTok channel for Passa Vida. I don't even know what to do on it, but I will try and work it out. Anyway, I'll be showing you the progress of it and also encouraging you as authors. Because I don't know about you, but I felt this all the time with TikTok, that whenever I see the videos on my daughter's phone, I feel like the dad that's shown up to the school disco to pick up my daughter. I'm standing on the edge, sitting in the car, arms crossed, waiting for them to come out, thinking, "Oh my gosh." But what I realize is, and what Susie has proven as well, is TikTok is not all about, teenagers, sharing their favorite songs and their favorite latest pop idols and the Kim Kardashians of this world. It's not all about that. What I realize now is that when you start your own channel on TikTok, you will attract an audience that is like-minded. And there's a large enough audience now for everyone to share on TikTok. Obviously, there's, I think probably billions of users of TikTok now. So I'm going to go to this with open arms. I'm going to, in the spirit of experimenting with all of this, I am going to try it and report back to you. But I'd like you to join me as well. By starting, if you've not, maybe start your own TikTok channel, and you can kind of give me some tips, and also I can shout about what you're doing on the social media platform as well. So that's the big one, social media wise, for this year. I am very excited today because I have the most incredible guest today. I'm just going to give our guest a very quick intro. Amy Newmark. Amy Newmark is the best-selling author, editor-in-chief, and publisher of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series, which was something which I grew up with. I've got a whole shelf of them in my library. I absolutely adore these books. And since 2008, Amy's published, are you ready for this? 100 191 books, and most of them are national bestsellers in both the US, Canada, and I think probably pretty much around the world, more than doubling the numbers of the Chicken Soup for the Soul titles in print today. Amy's also the author of Simply Happy, which is a crash course in chicken soup wisdom filled with easy to implement and practical tips for having a better life. So in this interview, we discuss how a trip to the slums of Brazil would have a major significance years later for Amy, and how Amy took over Chicken Soup during a financial catastrophe, how a humble book idea became one of the most recognized brands in America, and how Amy discovered that they had sold, in quotes, 300 million books they never knew about. And how on earth can you publish 20,000 stories in 15 years? Let's dive into part one of this interview, where I chat with Amy Newmark. So Amy Newmark, welcome to the Bestseller Experiment. How are you today?
I am fine. Thanks so much for having me on.
It's so lovely to have you on, Amy. And as I mentioned in the intro there, Chicken Soup for the Soul has been one of my favorite collections of books. And it's really such a unique concept that I know started, we can go back into the history of it, but I'm really interested in finding out about how you got involved, going back to 2008. How did it all start for you, and how did you get involved with Jack Canfield and Mark Victor Hansen?
Well, Jack and Mark had been doing it for 14 years in 2007, which is when they decided they wanted to sell the business to somebody else who could take it to the next level, because they were always doing lots of other things besides Chicken Soup for the Soul. They had their own writing careers, writing non-Chicken Soup for the Soul books, and they had their motivational speaking careers. So we heard that they were looking for a buyer. And so my husband and I and a business partner basically spent 9 months doing, tons of due diligence, and then arranged to do an LBO. It was probably one of the only LBOs done in America in 2008, because I don't know if you remember what was going on then, but
yeah, there was a little event happened, right, in 2008.
It was the absolute end of the world. Like, banks were failing, brokerage firms were failing. Everything was shutting down. Businesses all over the place were failing. It was probably a terrible time to buy a big media property with a lot of debt, because we did it as an LBO. And of course, then it turned out Borders, the big bookstore chain in the US, shut down, and all these independent bookstores were failing. And then the big box stores were cutting back the amount of shelf space they gave to books. I mean, we were so dumb. It was a terrible time to make this transaction. But we did it, and we survived. And we basically spent the next 4 years just surviving. And then by 2012, the economy was turning around, and we had kind of figured out how to run our business. And then we were off and running at that point. And since then, Chicken Soup for the Soul has expanded. We had a line of pet food through a licensee, and we took that in-house. So now we have this really successful high-end pet food for dogs and cats. And then our most important business is we have a huge entertainment company that does streaming, like free streaming versus subscription streaming of TV and movies. We're a big TV and movie distributor. We create some of our own TV programming and films. So that's our biggest business now. But we're here today to talk about our books, which is the heart of Chicken Soup for the Soul and the foundation for the goodwill that the brand has.
Yeah, absolutely. And when Chicken Soup for the Soul first came on the market, I remember the very first book that came out. And the thing that struck me about it was so different than anything I'd seen before. When did you first have your first experience with Chicken Soup for the Soul? Because I'm sure you probably had followed it from the early days as well. Can you remember when you first saw the first book?
Yeah, I was getting a divorce, and I think it was probably 1996. And a friend of mine brought me the original Chicken Soup for the Soul book and gave it to me along with another book called The Good Divorce. And I read The Good Divorce, and I didn't read the Chicken Soup for the Soul book. And I was like, I glanced at it and I was like, this is not directly relevant to me getting divorced. So I didn't read it. And then it just sat on my bookshelf until 2007. And I don't know, I must be a terrible mother, because my children, who are in their mid-30s, I never gave them a Chicken Soup for the Soul book. And apparently I was supposed to, because every child grew up reading like Chicken Soup for the Preteen Soul and Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul. And there were 4 different versions of Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul. But I guess they must have been exposed to the books at school because they knew about them. But I really wasn't that exposed to it, even though when we did our work in 2007 and 2008, and we did a big survey through one of these big polling companies, Harris or somebody, they discovered that 88% of Americans knew what Chicken Soup for the Soul was.
Wow.
Which was pretty amazing, because that meant, since they were talking to women and men, and men are not as likely to know, that meant that virtually every woman knew what Chicken Soup for the Soul was. And then probably 5/8 of all men knew what Chicken Soup for the Soul was. So it was pretty amazing. But I was not as well versed in it as most people. So I came to it with totally fresh eyes. And then when we were doing our due diligence in 2007, I was basically assigned the task of learning what the intellectual property was that we would be buying. And so I read 100 of the old Chicken Soup for the Soul titles.
Oh my gosh.
I spent 3 or 4 months reading 100 books, and I was blown away by how powerful they were, and, filled with ideas for what I would do going forward. And then I remember we were meeting with Random House because we were picking a distributor. We ended up with Simon & Schuster. And we were talking about what each of us was going to do. And I said, well, I'm going to decide what titles we're going to publish and run the book business and be the editor of the future titles, et cetera. And they said, you're the publisher. I said, okay, I'm the publisher. Like, I didn't even know what a publisher did, because I came from a Wall Street background and a finance and technology background. Yeah. So I became publisher, editor-in-chief, and, as it turns out, author, because I do a lot of rewriting, and we can talk about that later when we talk about, how we accept stories and what we do with them after we accept them. But I do a lot of rewriting. And so I really wear those 3 hats: author, editor-in-chief, and publisher.
My goodness me. And let's just go back to the beginnings of your interest in story as well, because you traveled, didn't you, when you were younger, before you kind of got into the business world, the finance, Wall Street. Tell us a little bit about how that connects with when you took over Chicken Soup for the Soul, and how, just tell us that backstory.
Yeah, so it was something that didn't even occur to me until I had to sit down and write a resume in 2008, because I had never had a resume, because I just went from job to job on Wall Street, through being like recruited from one place to the next. So I never needed a resume. And then I had to create a resume in 2008. And so I started writing down what I did in college. And then I realized, oh my God, I've already done a Chicken Soup for the Soul-like activity, because in college, I went to Harvard, which was a big impersonal place. And so to make it more personal, I picked a major that no one else was majoring in. I was the only person in the entire university who majored in Portuguese Brazilian studies. I had 2 professors. Yeah, it was a really great way to take a big impersonal institution and make it into a tiny little place for me. Right. And so I went to Brazil for a semester and did research for my thesis. And my thesis was about a popular form of poetry in the northeast of Brazil, which is a very poor part of Brazil. And this is basically a chanted poetry, and it's the poetry of the people. And it was published in these inexpensive, like crappy little paper booklets called folietos. And and they were sold in the marketplaces, and the poor people would buy them. And these were their books. And these folietos contained stories like folk tales, and then they were like classic stories. Then they were romances. There were religious stories. There was political dissent. It was a way of secretly doing political dissent while a dictatorship was in power in Brazil. And so I spent 3 months traveling around the northeast of Brazil at age 20, collecting these folietos. I collected hundreds of them and really have like the definitive collection of folietos from the mid 1970s, and taped all these interviews with people and went to all these basically poetry slams where the people would compete and do these poetry slams, or where they would on the spot come up with new poems. I was the subject of many of them because with blonde hair and blue eyes, I was such an oddity. For most of these people, they had never seen somebody with blonde hair and blue eyes before. Never. I mean, this was when was this? This was 1978.
Right.
And so there was no internet, I mean, there was some television. They thought maybe I could be from Sao Paulo, because down there you had like the people who have of German background or something, but they had never in person seen somebody who looked like me. And I had blonde hair down to my waist. So it was a very incredible experience traveling around collecting these. But anyway, there I was collecting stories from regular people and, collecting them and creating my thesis, which was a collection of these stories. And then I realized, oh my gosh, that's what I'm going to do at Chicken Soup for the Soul. So 30 years later, at age 50, I was doing the same thing again. So that was very circular. It really was. And I guess it just shows that it was meant to be.
Definitely. It's like life really moves in mysterious ways sometimes. And I always wonder sometimes when we do things in our life, we don't fully understand how they might play out in later life or make a connection for us, but everything is connected in some way. So that's a fantastic story. So here you are in 2007, 2008, looking at, what is probably one of the most well-known book series in the US, I'm thinking. I mean, I can't think of anything else that even comes close to it.
At the time, it was the best-selling book series, but it was about to be supplanted by Harry Potter. So Harry Potter became a bigger selling book series than Chicken Soup for the Soul right around the time that we were buying it. But that shows how big Chicken Soup for the Soul was as a series.
Exactly. And is it true now that in terms of sales, Chicken Soup for the Soul has surpassed like 500 million books? Is that right?
That was the number when we bought the company. We've never really updated it because it was way bigger back then than it is now. Like during my tenure, I've sold net units in the US and Canada of more than 10 million copies. And then I don't know how many we've sold overseas. And then there's all the copies that are sold through theft, intellectual property theft. I remember one year we got congratulated because we had some book that sold 300 million copies in China. That's really nice. That was not our book. It said Chicken Soup for the Soul on it, but it wasn't ours.
Oh my gosh, that's insane.
Yeah.
That's mad.
Yeah, that happens.
So I mean that's a rabbit hole we could go down. But the thing that I'm fascinated by is that since you've taken over running Chicken Soup for the Soul, you published 191 books, or probably even more now, but I worked that out to be about 12 to 13 books a year. Now, that is a pretty phenomenal output. So let's talk about how on earth do you manage to do that? I mean, there's roughly how many stories are there now in Chicken Soup for the Soul? Is it still the same number?
So there's 101 in each book.
101, yeah.
So we're talking, I've probably published close to 20,000 stories.
What are your writing dreams? Finishing that book? Quitting the day job? Becoming a best-selling author? Since 2016, we've interviewed and studied the advice of over 500 best-selling authors who've collectively sold over 1 billion books. And in the Bestseller Academy, we've incorporated powerful and proven strategies for success, inspiring fiction and non-fiction authors just like you to reach new heights and write their best book ever. Ready to take your writing to the next level with accountability, craft, coaching, and the most inspiring and exclusive community of like-minded writers? Well, your bestseller dreams are just a click away. Join us today at bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. That's bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. So that was part one of the interview with Amy Newmark, and check in next week to hear part two. But just as a little preview, there was something that Amy said at the very beginning of the part two episode. And she said, we have dozens of New York Times bestselling authors who started out writing for Chicken Soup for the Soul. And this completely blew me away. And it got me thinking. Now, writing a book's a major undertaking. Writing a short story or a small piece of writing doesn't take as long. And it also gives you a sense of satisfaction that you finish something. And we've got a ton of people on the Academy who are writing short stories and having a lot of success. Kate Baker and Karen Story come to mind who've had huge success with short stories. And I want to set you a challenge, maybe a challenge for this week or maybe a challenge for the next month. But I would like to challenge you to try and write a story, and maybe write a story that you feel might be good enough to pitch to Chicken Soup for the Soul. What I have with Amy is an exclusive part of the interview to help you. It's called The Secrets to Getting Published in Chicken Soup for the Soul. And Amy details the following. She talks about how the whole process of submitting the story works, what you get paid. Yes, you actually get paid. This isn't one of these kind of book projects where you have to pay to be published. You actually get paid when you get your stories in there. And also how you can become a part of an exclusive community of the Chicken Soup family of writers, which I didn't even know existed. It's a whole thing behind the scenes. It's amazing. And then how authors have used Chicken Soup as a platform to launch their writing careers. So what I've done is I've taken that part of the bonus interview and I've made that available on our free experiment tier in the Bestseller Academy for the next 2 weeks. So if you're interested in taking on that challenge and you want to get a bit of the inside scoop as to what they look for and how you submit the stories to Chicken Soup for the Soul, simply register for free by going to bestsellerexperiment.com/academy, and you'll get access to that interview exclusively for the next 2 weeks. And you won't be able to see that or hear that anywhere else. Now, talking of the Academy, there's some really exciting news which has been announced this week. And that is that there are 6 new incredible authors joining the Academy for this year. And all of them have been on the podcast multiple times. So I want to just quickly run through these incredible authors. So the first author is Gareth L. Powell, who was on the podcast not just more than a couple of months ago for the second time. Gareth is one of the greatest living sci-fi writers. He's won twice the British Science Fiction Award for Best Novel that was previously won by J.G. Ballard and none other than Arthur C. Clarke. So Gareth comes with so much incredible experience. We also have Lorna Cook, who you'll have heard on the podcast, a multi-RNA award winner of historical fiction and the romance chart topper, whose books are in all of the supermarkets in England, which is really hard to achieve. We also have Ian W. Sainsbury, bestseller, Kindle Storyteller Award winner, who writes thrillers, fantasy, and sci-fi. Then we also have, as another coach, Sarah Moorhead, thriller chart topper extraordinaire who taught the bestseller Stuart Turton, who wrote The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle that you may have seen. Again, the next coach is Pernilla Hughes, the queen of rom-com, published by HarperCollins. And finally, well, not finally, Kate Harrison, million-selling non-fiction and fiction author with Orion, Pan Macmillan, and Indie as well. And then finally, as mentioned earlier on this show, I'm really excited to announce that we have Susie Edge joining us as a coach. in the Academy. It's TikTok sensation with over 200 million views and nearly 500,000 followers, and shortlisted for the 2023 TikTok Book Award. So folks, if you would like to be coached by these incredible successful best-selling authors, pop along to the Academy. We are open for January right now, and the applications for January close on the 12th, which is really quick. It's the end of this week. So if you listen to this on the Monday, you've got until Friday to get your name on the list. And that's for fiction and non-fiction. So pop along to academy.bestsellerexperiment.com to register. Now, Patron of the Week. So our patron of the week this week is Steve Gowland. And Steve writes as S.C. Gowland, is author of many books. He's a 2-time semi-finalist, a dad, a grey Jedi, I'm not sure what that is, a school-run genius, absolutely know about that, Steve, a lover of kindness, which I love, gin, I also love that, dogs, cartoons, a GIF overuser, and a geek. Hey, Steve, we are very must have been separated at birth, I think. If you want to check out Steve, you can go to his website, scgowland.com. And on Twitter, he's at Steve Gowland. So, Steve, you are our patron of the week this week for being, you ready for this? Our longest serving patron of this podcast. You were one, if not the first person to sign up when we announced our patron system in 2017. That was 6 years ago. So, Steve, we are very grateful for you supporting this podcast every month. And if you love this show and you haven't signed up yet, you can be awesome like Steve and become a patron of the Bestseller Experiment by visiting bestsellerexperiment.com/support. And as a new feature, our Academy member of the week this week is Fiona Higgins. Now, Fiona writes as F.E. Higgins. You may know her because she's actually a very successful Irish children's author. Fiona's known for her books, The Bone Magician and The Black Book of Secrets, which you may have heard of. And the latter won the Bisto Honour Award in 2008. Fiona worked as a school teacher before becoming a full-time writer in the year 2000. Now, Fiona's written 7 books for children, the age 10 plus, 6 of which were published by Macmillan UK and 1 by Pearson's Education, which was for Heroes, which is a series about a reluctant boy reader. So if you have young kids, check out Fiona's books. They're absolutely brilliant. Fiona's actually sold over 100,000 books. She's had 7 books translated into different languages, and in the US they're published by Square Fish. And she's spoken at literary festivals and toured the US. Now, you might be thinking, what is Fiona doing in the Bestseller Academy? But this is one of the most amazing things about the Academy, is that it attracts not just people who are starting, writing for the first time. It attracts incredibly successful authors like Fiona. And in the Academy, Fiona is pivoting. She's always wanted to create a fiction series for adults. And so she's writing a fiction series set in the late 19th century with supernatural and literary elements. So I want to encourage you as well. So, you get to hang out with people like Fiona. We actually have a scheme in the Academy. It's a monthly writer buddy program where you rotate buddies each month. So you get a little accountability partner for the week, but you get to chat with them, send each other messages, talk about how bad your word count's going or how great it's going. And Fiona is one of those authors that you can hang out with. So the thing I love about the Academy is how we get this mix of new authors and experienced authors and incredibly successful authors in some cases, all working and sharing and cheering each other on. So do check that out. Now, let's talk about the wins this week. First win is from the lovely Rebecca McFarland, who's part of the BXP team. And Rebecca said, I am new to this group, only having discovered the podcast back in July. That would be last year. I hope you don't mind, but I just wanted to tell someone that as of this morning, I finished the first draft of my novel, The Madam of Morningside, at 77,630 words of it. I began it a year ago, adapted from a script I wrote for a BBC competition, which she won. But life got in the way and I stopped. And in May, pressured by a good friend, I dusted off the fledgling 17,500 word manuscript and entered the first 5,000 words into a debut novel competition launched at the LBF. First miracle, I was longlisted. Second miracle, I found the podcast, still binging, she says, and learned what not to do, including trying to finish a novel in a week after it was called in. My failure to make the shortlist or indeed hear from them again made sense. Since then, the 2 Marks and the incredible writers and professionals who have given their time to the podcast have not only filled me up with knowledge, they've inspired me to write every day, spurring me on in my quest to finish my book before the end of the year, which she did. And Rebecca finishes that message by saying, I am so very grateful. Well, Rebecca, we are very grateful for you sharing that incredible story. I think that story will inspire a lot of people listening to this who maybe, like you, have had something kicking around for a few years, not managed to really get going, get that momentum kicking in. And your story will inspire them. So thank you so much for sharing that, and congratulations. And here's a little challenge for you. When you finish that book, let me know and I'll give it a big old shout out on the podcast for you. Our second win of the week comes from Katie Wells, who's a member of the Academy. And she said, when I published A Blend of Magic, my aim was to sell it to 10 strangers. After receiving my first notification of my first royalty payment, woohoo, I have sold over 100 copies. Absolutely brilliant. Now, this is an amazing milestone, Katie. Not 2 milestones. Firstly, obviously, selling your first copy of any book's huge. But secondly, a massive milestone is receiving your first royalty payment. And I encourage every single person who's the other side of that, who still hasn't had their first royalty payment, to really push for that, because that's a kind of a seismic moment in your career as an author, that moment that you actually receive something in payment. And I always say this, you are now a professional author. When you receive payment for something, you become a professional in it. So Katie, officially a professional author. And when you all get your first, sale of your book, whenever that might be, and however it might come in, even if you just sell it to your mum or your friend or whoever, you become a professional author. And then once you start living by that and believing it, everything changes for you. So congratulations to both of you. And thank you so much for sending in your wins. And if you have any wins that you would like to send me, you know where to go. I listen and look out for all communications on the website, bestsellerexperiment.com. So you just pop along and click on the contact form there. Also, social media, you can watch a video of today's episode on YouTube at Bestseller Experiment. If you do go there, please subscribe, because it really helps get the podcast out there to a wider group of people. You can also join us on socials. Facebook is Bestseller Experiment. X or Twitter is Bestseller XP. And so is Instagram, Threads, and Pinterest at Bestseller XP. And next week, folks, we'll be having part 2 of an incredible interview with Amy, where we really go a lot deeper on the story behind the success of Chicken Soup for the Soul. And I hope it continues to inspire you. You can also check out today's show notes and links at bestsellerexperiment.com. And whilst you're there, sign up to our newsletter for weekly updates, news, and exclusives. And as I mentioned before, you can drop me a note by simply clicking on the contact form. Finally, if you want to get that book written, pop along to the 200-word challenge. That's 200wordchallenge.com, and join thousands of others building their daily writing habit. Can you win our first challenge and write at least 200 words every day for the next 7 days? Go for it. So everyone, have a fantastic writing week. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, and I really appreciate it. And so until next time, it's a goodbye from me, Mark Desvaux, aka Bookmark. Goodbye.